At 47, Johnny Depp no longer chased spotlights. They chased him. He'd already lived 1,000 lifetimes on screen. The pirate, the madman, the misunderstood lover. But behind a makeup and slow-burning cigarettes, he carried something the cameras never caught. A quiet, unshakable faith. It wasn't loud, wasn't performative, but it was there. In the way he touched the worn leather cover of the pocket Bible in his coat, in the hushed prayers he whispered before walking into courtrooms or onto stages. To him, God was not a church or a rule. He was mercy, and mercy was all Johnny had ever wanted. When he met Amber Heard, she was 23 and burning with ambition. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her intensity that drew him in. She listened with hunger, looked with challenge, and laughed like someone who'd already decided the world would never tame her. They were opposites. He, the soulful romantic, built from pain and poetry. She, the thunderstorm, electric, erratic, wild. But opposites attract, and sometimes they ignite. For a while, things were beautiful. In Paris cafes, he'd recite old psalms like love poems. Amber would listen with a smirk, teasing him with phrases like, "You really believe in all that old man in the sky stuff?" He'd smile back, shrug. "It's not about the sky. It's about what keeps you standing when everything else falls." She'd roll her eyes, but never push too far. At first. But fame doesn't just bring fans. It brings pressure, cameras, questions, people who want a headline, not the truth. And slowly, cracks began to form, not in Johnny's faith, but in her respect for it. It started subtly. At an awards afterparty, she joked loudly to their table. "He won't even sleep with me before praying. I'm dating a holy relic, apparently." The group laughed. Johnny smiled politely, his face tight. Later that night, in the car, he looked out the window and said nothing. Amber leaned in, drunk on wine and adrenaline. "Oh, come on, don't sulk. It's a joke." But he didn't laugh. "My faith isn't a punchline, Amber." She paused, then scoffed. Well, maybe it shouldn't be so fragile. That night, something shifted. Not because she mocked him, but because she enjoyed it. And deep down, he knew this wasn't just about two different beliefs. It was about power and the need to belittle what you can't control. He lay awake for hours, the words echoing. Maybe it shouldn't be so fragile. The thing was, it wasn't. But he was. And he'd just begun to understand what that would cost. The next few weeks felt like walking barefoot on shattered glass. Beautiful on the outside, agony underneath. Amber, radiant in every tabloid photo, now had a new favorite joke: Johnny's Jesus complex. At brunch with friends, during interviews, even in private. "You think he's acting? That's not a role. He actually thinks he's some redeemed sinner saved by God." Sometimes she'd say it with a laugh, other times with venom, but always just sharp enough to leave a mark. Johnny didn't retaliate. That wasn't his way. He'd nod, smile faintly, and excuse himself. To smoke, to think, to pray. But prayer was getting harder now. Not because of Amber, but because of the shame he felt for letting her diminish something so personal and not defending it. He began to feel like a coward in his own skin. One night, after an argument that spun wildly from a late arrival to her rolling her eyes at him, saying grace before dinner, Johnny retreated to the studio in their home. She slammed the door behind him. He sat at the piano in silence. The same fingers that once moved effortlessly over keys felt stiff, hesitant. He wasn't sure if it was the wine or the weight of pretending things were fine. Amber burst in minutes later, barefoot and fuming. "I don't get it, Johnny. You pretend to be this deep, wounded genius, but you hide behind scripture like it's a costume." He didn't flinch, but inside, something in him cracked. "You don't have to believe in what I believe," he said quietly, "but I won't let you spit on it anymore." That was the first time he raised his voice. The first time he didn't retreat. Amber stared at him, caught off guard. But instead of softening, she laughed. A cold, hollow sound. "God's not going to save you from me." She walked out, and that sentence hung in the air like smoke. Johnny sat there long after. Those words would repeat in his head for months. Not because he feared them, but because he began to believe she was right. God wouldn't save him. Not from her. Not from the storm. Because maybe God didn't rescue you from the fire. Maybe he just walked through it with you. Johnny had always loved Sundays. Not because of tradition or sermons, but because Sunday mornings felt still, like a breath held by the universe. He used to sit on his porch with black coffee and a tattered book of devotionals. Sometimes he'd hum old gospel melodies under his breath, barely audible, but enough to feel like he was tethered to something eternal. But now Sunday mornings felt like battlefields. Amber would stomp through the house barefoot, the sound of her phone's speaker blaring news or celebrity gossip. She'd make sure the TV volume was just loud enough to drown out the quiet. And every time Johnny stepped outside with his Bible, she'd roll her eyes. "You really gonna waste another morning talking to the sky, Johnny?" He said nothing. She said everything with her smirk. There was a moment, one moment, that carved itself into his memory. They had guests over. Amber's crowd. Models, influencers, producers. The kind who laughed too hard and drank too fast. One of them, a young director in designer sunglasses, leaned in toward Johnny and asked, "So is it true you believe in God? Like for real?" Amber, already 2 glasses deep, cut in before Johnny could answer. "Oh, he doesn't just believe, he talks to him. Like bedtime chats with the Almighty. It's adorable." Everyone laughed. But Johnny froze. Not because he was embarrassed, but because he felt something worse. Hollow. As if every part of him that had once been sacred had now become a party trick. And he had let it happen. That night, he found her on the balcony with a cigarette, wind sweeping her hair. "Why do you do it?" he asked. "Mock me like that. Like it's a game to you." She didn't look at him. "Because you hide behind it," she said, voice colder than the breeze. "You use God as your shield. So I test it." "No," he said quietly. "You don't test him. You test me." She finally turned. Same difference. He walked away that night. Not from her. Not yet. But from something inside himself. He couldn't pray that evening. Not because he didn't believe, but because he was angry. Angry that the person he loved most was the one trying hardest to unmake him. And part of him was starting to let her. It was a Tuesday when he found it. A small wooden cross that used to hang beside his childhood sketch of a dove. It had been carved by his uncle, worn smooth by time and fingerprints. Now it lay on the floor, snapped clean down the middle. Johnny stood there in the doorway of his study, staring at it. At first, he thought maybe it had fallen, that maybe the nail had slipped or the wall cracked. But the frame was intact. The nail was missing. Amber must have taken it down. It wasn't rage that swept through him. It was grief, the kind that doesn't shout, it whispers. He picked it up and held both halves in his hand, fingers trembling. The break was jagged, cruel. One side of the cross was clean, the other splintered like a wound. Later that night, she came in humming, wearing one of his shirts like armor. "Lose something, Saint Depp?" He didn't answer, just turned to her with quiet eyes and said, "What?" She shrugged, sipping from a wine glass. "It's just wood. It's part of me." "No," she said coldly. "It's part of who you pretend to be." That cut deeper than she knew, because Johnny had spent most of his life pretending to be whole, pretending to be in control, pretending the cameras didn't steal pieces of him every day. But his faith, that wasn't pretend. That was his anchor when the waves got too loud, and she just snapped it in half. He didn't speak to her for 2 days, not out of punishment, but to protect whatever was left of his silence, of his center. In those 2 days, he didn't touch alcohol, didn't turn on a single song. He just walked, miles at a time, LA to nowhere, smoke curling through the air like unspoken prayers. People passed him on the street. Some recognized him, most didn't. He wore a hat low and pain like cologne. One night, while sitting on the edge of his bed, he took the 2 broken halves of the cross and tied them together with a red guitar string. It wasn't perfect, but it held, just like he did. He looked in the mirror and said out loud, not to her, not to the world, but to whatever still watched over him from above, "I'm still here." It was the first time in weeks he felt like he meant it. It was near midnight when she walked past his studio door, barefoot, silent, the hallway dim. She wasn't looking for him. She just wanted her charger. But when she heard his voice, quiet and broken on the other side of the wall, she froze. Johnny was praying, not the kind of prayer you say for show, not the rehearsed kind whispered before interviews. This was raw, ragged, a man peeling his heart open in the dark. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Lord. I keep forgiving her, but I think I'm losing myself in the process." A pause, a breath, and if I'm honest, I'm angry. I'm angry you let me fall for someone who sees me as a joke. His voice cracked. I know she's broken too. I know she is. But I don't know how to love her without losing pieces of you and me. Silence. Then, please remind me who I am. Amber's fingers slipped off the doorframe. Her breath caught. Something hit her then. Not guilt, not quite, but recognition. She backed away, slowly, almost as if he could hear her heartbeat. In the kitchen, she poured herself wine with shaky hands. She thought about laughing, mocking him again, but she couldn't, because for the first time since they met, she realized she wasn't stronger than him. He was praying, still tethered to something bigger. She was running, always had been, running from herself, from her shame, from anyone who dared to believe in redemption. That night, she didn't sleep. Johnny never knew she'd been at the door, but he felt lighter the next morning, like some invisible thread had been rewoven. Not repaired, not restored, but noticed. Amber made him coffee without saying a word. He didn't ask why. He didn't thank her, because between them now stood something unsaid, a fragile, flickering awareness. He still believed, and maybe, just maybe, a part of her still wished she could. But faith isn't contagious. You have to want it. You have to kneel for it. You have to surrender. And Amber? She only knew how to fight. It was supposed to be a harmless late-night segment, a casual sit-down, plug the next film, smile for the camera. But Johnny should have known better. The host was sharp, famous for his witty edge. But tonight, that edge cut bone. They were halfway through when the host grinned and said, "So, rumor is you're turning into some kind of holy man now. You blessing the cast before takes, or just reading psalms on set?" The audience laughed. Johnny gave a tight smile. "No blessings. Just peace, when I can find it." The host leaned in. "Peace, huh? That why you let your ex walk all over you and still prayed for her?" The room went still. For a second, Johnny's face didn't move. Just his hands, curling in a fist beneath the desk. He let the silence linger. He could have fired back. He could have laughed it off. Instead, he said calmly, "Forgiveness doesn't mean weakness. It means you remember who you are, even when they forget who they were." The crowd didn't know whether to clap or cringe. But Amber was watching. She saw the clip the next morning. It was all over Twitter, TikTok, Reddit. Some mocked him. Some praised him. But one thing was clear. He hadn't dragged her name. Not once. He could have burned her publicly. He had the chance. He had the motive. The receipts. But he didn't. He forgave her, even while the world gave him the mic to crucify her. And for the first time in a long time, Amber cried. Not from pity, but from shame. Because she remembered all the nights she'd mocked his quiet, his calm, his prayers. And now the world was seeing something she hadn't allowed herself to. He wasn't weak. He was stronger than all of them. That night, Johnny came home to a note on the table. No signature, no apology, just one line. "You never hated me, even when I hated you for believing in something better." He read it twice, then lit a candle, and prayed for her. Again, this time, not for her to come back, but for her to heal. Because love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it just means you don't stop hoping they'll find the light. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of silence from Amber. No texts, no rumors, no drunk rants in tabloids. Just stillness, like the space after a storm that no one talks about. Johnny tried not to read into it. Try to focus on work, on painting, on the Psalms, on the 1,000 little anchors he kept tied to sanity. But part of him still waited, because somewhere deep down, he knew she wasn't done yet. Not with him, not with herself, not with the war she kept waging inside. It came unexpectedly. He was on set, filming a quiet scene, when a PA ran over and handed him a phone. "Sir, you might want to see this." It was a clip. Amber, sitting in what looked like a therapy office, filmed on a phone. Maybe leaked, maybe intentional. The camera was shaky, but her voice was clear. "People think I hated Johnny because he was calm, but I hated him because he believed in things I couldn't touch. He had something I couldn't destroy." She paused, trembling. "I used to think faith was weakness, a crutch, but he wore it like armor, and I mocked him for it. I mocked God in front of him, laughed in his face while he prayed for me." Her voice cracked. "He prayed for me. There were tears, real ones, not court show tears, not rehearsed. And when I did the worst thing I could, mocked his God, broke his cross, threw away everything, he didn't fight back. He just kept loving me, quietly, and that scared me more than anything." Johnny froze. On set, surrounded by cameras. But suddenly he was just a man again, watching a ghost apologize. That night, he didn't drink, didn't call, didn't post. He just sat by the window, holding the guitar string-wrapped cross. Amber's words played on loop in his mind. He had something I couldn't destroy. She was wrong about one thing. She could destroy. She had. But what survived wasn't him. It was what lived in him. And that was the part she could never touch. Not then. Not now. He knelt. This time not in pain, but in thanks. Not for her return, but for the clarity. Because some love stories aren't meant to last. Some are just meant to point us back to God. 2 days later, the video of Amber's therapy session went viral. Not because it was scandalous. Not because it was angry. But because it was human. Real tears. Real regret. No PR team. No court theatrics. Just a woman, breaking down, publicly, admitting she laughed in the face of faith, and still was loved. The media didn't know what to do with it. Some spun it as redemption. Others said she was manipulating the public again. A few called it an Oscar-worthy performance. But Johnny? He didn't care how it was framed. Because behind the noise, he'd heard the one thing he never thought she'd say. I knew I was hurting someone who only ever wanted to save me. A producer asked him the next morning, "You gonna respond to her? Set the record straight." He smiled, slow and quiet. "There's nothing straight about that record, man. Let her speak. But don't you want to tell your side?" Johnny leaned back in his chair. "I did. Every time I stayed silent when she screamed. Every time I picked up the cross she threw. Every time I forgave her without needing a camera on." The producer didn't say much after that. Because he understood. Sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is not respond. Later that night, Johnny took out the old wooden cross again. The same one she once threw into the fireplace. He'd pulled it out, charred but whole. Kept it ever since. A symbol of survival. Of grace under fire. Of something no flame could eat away. He hung it on the wall. Not to remember her, but to remember what love costs when you do it with faith. Amber, meanwhile, disappeared from the spotlight again. Not hiding. Healing. Not apologizing. Unraveling. Because true regret doesn't need a platform. It needs time, silence, and surrender. And for the first time in her life, she was learning all three. And Johnny? He kept praying. Not for her to come back. Not for revenge. Just for the strength to keep loving without hate. Because faith isn't loud. And healing isn't public. And sometimes the ones who mock you the hardest are just the ones most desperate to believe again. He didn't know she was listening. That night, alone in his house, tucked away from the flashing cameras and headlines, Johnny knelt beside the window. The same window he had sat by during her trial, during her silence, during everything. He didn't pray like priests do. No theatrics. No declarations. Just a whisper. A quiet conversation with the only constant in his life. "God, I know I messed up a lot. I held on when I should have let go. I gave love to someone who only understood control. But you never left. Even when I questioned you to. And she wasn't evil. Just lost. I know that now. If there's still a spark in her soul, protect it. If she ever kneels like this someday, answer her before she gets bitter. She hated my faith because she couldn't feel her own. But I never stopped seeing the little girl under all that fury. Heal her. I'll be okay." He exhaled. No tears. Just stillness. But Amber, 2 blocks away, heard every word. It wasn't a coincidence. She had returned to LA quietly. No press. No agent. Just a borrowed car and a desire to drive past the past. She hadn't meant to stop outside his gate. Hadn't planned to get out and walk near the edge of his property. But something pulled her. The old Johnny would have had security, shoo her away. But that night, there was no one. Just his silhouette near the window. And his voice. She stood behind the hedges, listening. Frozen. Unwanted tears streaming. He wasn't asking for her to love him back. He was asking for her to heal. That broke her. Because no man had ever prayed for her like that. They'd used her, praised her, feared her. But none had ever loved her soul. Until Johnny. Even now. Even after all she'd done. She left before he saw her. She didn't want pity. But in that moment, something cracked inside her. Something no amount of alcohol, court victories, or defiant interviews had touched. It wasn't guilt. It was awakening. Because when someone prays for your soul without expecting anything in return, you either run forever or fall to your knees and finally listen. Amber didn't sleep that night. She stared at the hotel ceiling, motionless, her mind echoing with the tremble in Johnny's voice. It wasn't the prayer itself that shook her. It was how he never once asked for her back. He didn't beg, didn't curse her name, didn't even hope for a second chance. He just wanted her to heal. And that kind of love was terrifying, because she'd spent her whole life equating love with possession, with being wanted, desired, obeyed. But here he was, the man she mocked, humiliated, tried to destroy, and he'd let her go with peace. Who does that? She didn't have an answer. The next morning, she found herself standing in front of a church. She didn't go inside. Not yet. She couldn't. Not after everything. But she stared at the door for a long time, imagining what it might feel like to walk in without shame, without performance, to be known and forgiven. She wasn't ready, but the fact that she even considered it, that scared her more than anything. That afternoon, she sat in front of a mirror at the hotel. No makeup, no team, just her, 37 years old. And for the first time, she really looked, not at the actress, not at the survivor, not at the headline, just the woman. She whispered aloud, as if speaking to someone else entirely. I ruined the only man who ever saw me. There it was. Truth, bitter and sharp. He gave me faith. I spat on it. He gave me love. I used it. And still, he prayed. She looked in her own eyes and didn't see power or confidence. She saw a scared child, gripping control like a sword because it was the only thing she'd ever learned to trust. That night, she opened the Bible Johnny once tried to gift her. She had thrown it across the room the day he gave it to her. Called it a book for cowards who don't know how to think. But he kept it safe. Now it was hers again. On the inside cover, in Johnny's handwriting. For when everything else burns, this remains. She touched the words. They weren't for revenge. They were a lifeline. And she had almost missed it. Amber Heard didn't become a believer overnight. But something shifted. And for the first time since she could remember, she didn't feel alone in the room. She felt watched, not by cameras, but by something quieter, something holy. 2 weeks passed. Amber didn't speak to Johnny, didn't text, didn't appear in the press. The world assumed she was retreating again, maybe planning another comeback, or licking wounds after yet another PR misfire. But inside her room, something else was happening. Every morning began the same. No phone, no press briefings, just her, a cup of black coffee, and the Bible. It still felt strange, alien, like holding a relic from someone else's life. But the words started piercing her, not like daggers, more like quiet echoes from a place she'd buried deep. Bless those who persecute you. Love keeps no record of wrongs. He who is without sin. The verses read like a secret letter from Johnny's soul, as if everything he had tried to show her, he had already believed in. She couldn't decide what hurt more, that she mocked him for it, or that he'd been so right. Late one night, she scrolled through old photos of them. Not the red carpet ones, the real ones. Candid shots he took of her asleep on the balcony. Goofy selfies she deleted from her socials years ago. One video she never knew he'd recorded, of her laughing in the kitchen, holding a wooden spoon like a microphone, singing off-key. He'd saved everything. Even when she'd deleted him from her life, he'd kept her alive in his. She started crying halfway through the reel. Silent sobs. No audience. Because in those captured moments, she finally saw it. He hadn't just loved her beauty. He had loved her brokenness. And she had set fire to it with gasoline and pride. Meanwhile, Johnny was across town, playing guitar in a dim-lit studio. Not for a record, just for the quiet. A producer asked him if he ever thought about speaking to her again. He said nothing at first, just played a soft, haunting melody. Then, if she ever wants peace, she knows where I am. But I won't chase a ghost. Amber watched one of his old interviews that night. In it, the host asked, "You've had so many betrayals in love. How do you keep believing in it?" Johnny smiled gently. "Because I don't confuse love with control. Love's not supposed to win. It's supposed to outlast." She paused the video, let those words settle like ash on her skin. She wasn't sure she could ever ask for his forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to forgive herself. Amber booked a private flight to London, not to escape, to revisit a place where she'd once felt untouchable, a film set, years ago, before Johnny, before the public collapse. She thought standing in those old rooms might reignite something powerful, A reminder of who she was before love cracked her open. But when she arrived at the studio lot, the security didn't recognize her. They asked for her name twice, smiled politely, apologized. It stunned her, not because she expected fame to last forever, but because for the first time, she felt like a ghost in her own legend. The girl who used to own every room now felt like a trespasser in her past. That night, in a tiny rented flat outside Soho, she stared at the draft of a letter she'd written to Johnny weeks ago. She hadn't sent it. Too raw, too revealing. But now maybe it was time. She read it aloud to herself, trembling. You believed in something I mocked. You reached for something I called foolish. But your quiet, trembling faith, that invisible thing I couldn't destroy, it outlasted everything I tried to burn. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't want you to take me back. But I need you to know, I finally see what you saw. Not in me. In him. She paused. There were no tears left. Only the dull ache of someone who had run too far and now faced the vast, quiet nothing of having no more excuses. I once called God weak. But now I realize it takes unimaginable strength to love someone who's done everything to kill the love in return. She folded the letter. Didn't seal it. Didn't send it. Not yet. Meanwhile, Johnny was in a small, dusty chapel in New Orleans. Unannounced. No fans. No cameras. He lit a candle in silence. Watched the flame twist. A nun, old, kind-eyed, noticed him sitting alone. Lost someone? She asked gently. He smiled faintly. No, just letting go of the pieces they left behind. Across the ocean, Amber finally opened her hotel window. Let the wind scatter the ashes of a cigarette she hadn't even wanted. The sky was thick and gray, but somewhere deep inside her, a thought surfaced. Maybe redemption didn't start with apology. Maybe it started with finally choosing truth, even when no one was listening. 3 months passed. No calls. No headlines. No scandals. Amber disappeared from the spotlight completely, by choice this time. She had moved to a quiet village in the south of France, rented a modest stone cottage where no one cared about her past, her name, or her fame. She spent her mornings walking barefoot through dew-covered fields, afternoons in solitude, reading, journaling, even painting. And every night, before bed, she would pray, not out loud, not with polished words, just a whisper into the dark. Make me whole again. Not even knowing who she was speaking to, but knowing someone was listening. One morning, she opened her laptop and saw an email from an unknown address. No subject line, just 2 words. Still praying. She stared at it for a full minute. No signature, no emojis, just that. And she knew it was Johnny. He hadn't written to guilt her, or lure her back, or demand an explanation. He was just reminding her he hadn't stopped. She didn't respond, not because she didn't want to, but because part of her still felt unworthy, as if any reply would contaminate the peace he had finally found. Instead, she wrote him a letter she never sent. There's no verse for what I did, no parable for a woman who loved a man's light and tried to bury it in her own shadow. But I'm trying now, not to fix the past, just to stop repeating it. I see now that you're God. He never needed to prove himself. He just waited for me to stop performing long enough to notice he never left. She folded the letter, set it in a drawer, then walked outside into the sun. Back in Los Angeles, Johnny sat on the edge of a studio rooftop, watching the city breathe beneath him. He didn't know what Amber was doing. Didn't ask. He only knew one thing. He didn't hate her. He never had. Because what he saw in her, the broken brilliance, the fight, the fire, wasn't something to be erased. It was something to be mourned and forgiven, even if she never forgave herself. In an interview months later, when asked if he still believed in love after everything, Johnny smiled. Not the smile of a man who won, the smile of a man who had let go. I believe in something bigger now, he said quietly. Something that outlasts heartbreak, outlasts pride, even outlasts us. He looked past the cameras. I call him by name. Autumn crept in like a whispered confession. Amber walked through rustling vineyards near her cottage, hands deep in her coat pockets, breath visible in the cool morning air. The world had forgotten her, and for once that brought peace. No flashing bulbs, no editors rewriting her name into something monstrous, just silence, and space to finally understand what she had destroyed. One evening, She found herself rewatching an old behind-the-scenes clip from the Rum Diary, the film where she and Johnny had first met. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't staged. It was a grainy, handheld shot of them sitting side by side on a dock between takes. Johnny was reading. She was watching him. He didn't notice. There was no laughter, no flirting, just presence. The kind that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that makes you feel seen without performance. She paused the video, closed the laptop, and wept. Not for what had happened, but for what never had the chance to become. That night, she lit a candle. And this time, she wrote him not a letter, but a prayer. For the first time, not about her guilt, but about his freedom. May he never carry the weight of what I broke. May peace wrap around him like the silence I once feared. May love, real love, find him, the kind that doesn't need mending after every storm. She folded the note, burned it in the candle's flame. Let the smoke carry it to wherever God listens. Meanwhile, Johnny sat in a hotel room in Prague after wrapping a quiet indie film. The city outside was misted in amber light. He wasn't lonely, just reflective. He turned on a small cassette player he traveled with. A gift from his daughter years ago. Press play. It was a recording he'd made himself. Not for anyone else. A bluesy melody. Just him on guitar. And then, faintly in the background, his voice, whispering, almost lost. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without pain. He smiled at the crackling audio. Not everything broken needs fixing. Some things just need releasing. Somewhere, across the world, Amber sat beneath a tree, looking up at a sky she once tried to control. And for the first time, she felt small. And in that smallness, she felt something holy. A year passed. A full year without interviews, without courtrooms, without her name trending in bitter hashtags. Amber had learned how to live small. She volunteered at a local vineyard, taught English to village children, took long walks without needing to be admired. But every once in a while, she would sit at her small wooden desk and imagine what she would say to Johnny if the past wasn't so sharp between them. This time, she did write it. In ink. On parchment. No typing. No edits. The letter was a goodbye, but not the cowardly kind. It was a confession of sorts. You once told me faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's choosing love in the middle of it. I used to laugh at that. But now I think doubt might be the beginning of everything sacred. I lied to you with smiles. I weaponized silence. I ridiculed what you found holy. And yet, you never became what I accused you of being. You stayed kind. Not perfect, but real. She ended the letter with 4 words. I finally see him. She sealed it, addressed it to his agent's office. But on the way to the post office, she stopped. Not out of fear, out of understanding. The letter wasn't for him anymore. It was for her. For the woman who had built her worth on attention and finally learned to live without it. Johnny never got the letter, but he didn't need it. Because weeks later, during an anonymous visit to a rehab center in Arizona, where he often played music for recovering addicts, something shifted in him. One of the young women he met, barely 20, asked him quietly, "Do you still believe people can change?" He looked at her, saw the same haunted eyes Amber once had, and he smiled, only when they want nothing in return for it. That night, he took out an old pocket Bible a fan had given him years ago. For the first time, he read it not like poetry or myth, but like truth. He stopped on a verse that felt underlined by the day. He who is forgiven much, loves much. Johnny set the book down and whispered, not to anyone in the room, but to the stillness within him, "I love you anyway." The sun bled over the Pacific as Johnny stood barefoot on a Malibu beach, the wind tugging gently at the collar of his shirt. It was late, and the sky burned with that kind of orange that looks almost biblical. He wasn't there for nostalgia. He was there for silence. And for memory, not of her, exactly, but of the part of himself that had survived her. A small wooden cross hung around his neck now. Nothing ornate, just 2 worn sticks bound by string, given to him by a war veteran he'd met in a VA hospital while shooting a documentary. The man had said, "You look like someone who's been burned and walked anyway." That's all faith really is. Johnny had kept it ever since. Never took it off, not even during film shoots. He watched the waves now, rising and collapsing like stories too heavy to carry. And as the tide curled around his ankles, he found himself whispering again. Not to her, but to the God he once thought belonged only to Sunday morning sermons and judgmental stares. You gave her back to herself. That was more than I ever could. Thank you for not giving up on either of us. Even when we did. He stayed until the stars flickered awake. Until his shadow vanished completely into the night. Across the ocean, Amber stood in the back pew of a crumbling village chapel. A child's voice echoed through the old stone, singing something soft, something ancient. She didn't understand the words, but she didn't need to. The melody alone stripped her bare. And for the first time, she knelt, not to apologize, but to worship. Not because she was worthy, but because something greater had never stopped believing she could be. She didn't need to see him again. That was the difference now. Love, real love, the kind that costs something, doesn't always end in reunion. Sometimes it ends in release. And sometimes that is the miracle. Months later, Johnny stood backstage at a small theater in Paris. No cameras, no headlines, just a quiet benefit concert for an orphanage rebuilding after a fire. He tuned his guitar in the dark, listening to the crowd murmur beyond the velvet curtain. It was mostly locals, people who didn't care about trials, tabloids, or internet battles. People who only came for the music. When the host whispered, "You're up," Johnny smiled, nodded, and stepped into the soft light. He didn't play any hits. Instead, he told a story, not in words, but in chords, in the space between notes. He played the melody he'd written during the darkest year of his life, the one he never recorded, the one only God had heard. It was jagged, beautiful, wounded, and when he reached the final chorus, a quiet, broken progression, he closed his eyes and saw not her face, but the empty chair where she would have sat if the world had gone differently. He held that silence for a long time, and then let the final note fade like breath on glass. The audience didn't erupt in applause. They sat still, moved, and that, somehow, meant more. Amber heard about the concert from an old director friend. No video, no bootlegs, just a blurry photo of him under the spotlight, looking both older and freer. She stared at it for a long time. No anger, no pain, just thought how far they both had come. She turned off her phone, stepped outside into the early morning chill, and walked barefoot onto the dewy grass. And somewhere between her breath and the bird's song, she whispered, "Thank you for not letting me win." Because if she had, if the manipulation, the performance, the power games had worked, she never would have met the woman she was now. The one who no longer needed the world's attention, just heaven's mercy. And Johnny? He never spoke her name again. But every time he stepped on stage, he wore the cross, not for who hurt him, but for who healed him. Years later, a quiet afternoon in the French countryside, Johnny sat under an olive tree, notebook open, guitar resting on his knee. No entourage, no questions, just wind, bees, and the occasional crow. His hair had gone mostly silver. His hands, still adorned with rings, trembled slightly when he wrote. But his eyes were clear, like someone who had finally forgiven the man in the mirror. In the distance, a girl, maybe 10, laughed as she chased a butterfly through tall grass. She reminded him of his daughter when she was little, and of something deeper, the lightness he thought he'd lost forever. He pulled from his satchel a folded piece of paper, yellowed from age, unsent, Amber's letter. He had never received it officially, but someone, a former assistant, maybe, had mailed it years after the storm, without a return address. No explanation, just that ink, that desperate, unfinished grace. He read it again, slowly. There was no bitterness in the words anymore, only a woman reaching for redemption in the only way she knew how. He smiled sadly, then stood, walked to a small stream behind the trees, and released it into the water, watched it float, curl, and vanish. Not because it no longer mattered, but because it no longer owned him. Meanwhile, in South America, Amber sat at a cafe in Bogota, holding a worn journal. Her Spanish was fluent now, her posture softer. She had published nothing in years, chased no screens. Instead, she wrote short stories under a pen name, all set in places with no signal and no past. Stories about forgiveness that asked for nothing. Stories about men like him, women like who she used to be. Neither reached for each other again, because some souls are not meant to be reunited, only remembered, with reverence and caution, and, finally, peace. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, Don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss another. Click on the screen to hear the next raw, unforgettable journey.